After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker, as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. But when the Jews opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them,
"Your blood be on your own heads. I am clear of my responsibility. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles."
Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. Crispus, the synagogue ruler, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard him believed and were baptized. One night, the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision.
Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in the city.
So Paul stayed for a year and a half, teaching them the Word of God. While Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him into court.
This man,
They charged,
is persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law.
just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to the Jews,
If you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves questions about words and names and your own law, settle the matter yourselves. I will not be a judge of such things.
so he had them ejected from the court. Then they all turned on Sosthenes, the synagogue ruler, and beat him in front of the court. But Gallio showed no concern whatever. Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Then he left the brothers and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchrea because of a vow he had taken. They arrived at Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila. He himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to spend more time with them, he declined. But as he left, he promised,
I will come back, if it is God's will.
Then he set sail from Ephesus. When he landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church and then went down to Antioch. After spending some time in Antioch, Paul set out from there and traveled from place to place throughout the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and talked about Jesus accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. When Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there to welcome him. On arriving, he was a great help to those who by grace had believed, for he vigorously refuted the Jews in public debate, proving from the Scriptures that Jesus was the Christ.
All right, welcome back to Acts chapter 18. So I need you to do something here, because chapter 18, you're going to need to put on your track shoes, grab a map, and then also get a pen and paper, because we're going to find a lot of new people. We're going to go to a lot of new cities, and we're also going to change sort of management styles for this missionary trip that Paul's on. So buckle up. That's all I can.
Bring your Dramamine if you get seasick.
Oh yeah, it's going to happen. So so we left yesterday at Athens with Paul basically by himself, and he leaves and he goes to Corinth, which, you know, is just not too far away. And immediately when Paul gets into Corinth, and he's by himself, because Timothy and Silas are still up in Berea, or in Philippi.
Berea, yeah, you're right.
Berea, yeah. And so Paul gets into town. He gets into Corinth, and he meets up with Aquila, and he meets up with his wife, Aquila's wife, Priscilla, and he finds out they're tent makers, and so they go basically almost into business with each other. That's what we sort of find in verse 2 and 3. So, Gary, why don't you talk a little bit about this? Well, actually, you can take it any direction you want. You can talk about Corinth, you can talk about Priscilla and Aquila, or you could talk about tent making, or you can talk about all of them. It's all yours.
Yeah, there's 3 separate hours that we could go, but I won't do that. I'll try to condense.
Wait a second.
I just found it.
Wait a second. I forgot to say you can talk about the about them getting kicked out of Rome too. So
I will. Okay, I'll try to do it all.
Take a topic, anyone you want.
Yeah. Well, I found it interesting that when Paul leaves Athens, and we know, as you mentioned, that Silas and Timothy aren't with him, so he's traveling alone. He basically, when he arrives there in Corinth, he doesn't have his front men. You know, he doesn't have the guys that are going to make some of the arrangements while he's kind of focused on the preaching and the evangelism part of it. It seems like they've had John Mark along with Barnabas, and now Silas and he have Timothy along, and they, helped make things happen. They were the roadies, if you will, to help the main attraction. But he's on his own, and where's he going to stay that night? Where's he going to eat? You got to think about if you were traveling like that, what are you going to do? Does he have any money on him anymore? Did he spend it all in Athens? Because he got shipped there real quick, and we don't know what he had. So he ends up at meeting Priscilla and Aquila. How did that happen? Well, we find out here, and only here, that Paul is a tent maker. And it's a term for a profession that was a lot wider than just making tents. And we think about tents as recreational stuff, but for that day and age, that was sort of that was more than just recreation. For the Roman army, that was where they stayed. That was their quarters they would put up. In fact, I think I have a visual of a Roman army encampment with the tents. I got to see if I'm showing it right.
You got it.
But right in the middle, that kind of square, it's close enough. You can see, there it is, the tents. And it's a tent camp. And it was the commander's responsibility to provide for them. And they often bought, or they always almost bought from local places. And so that was a lot to both either repair or replace those tents. And then they were mostly made of leather and waterproof, which is great. So they're leather workers. The tanning and all the preparation was done by somebody else, but they would get the right leathers and skins, and they also, Paul was from a place in the world that was known for its specific fabric that they made out of goat's hair. It was called silicium, and from Cilicia, where Tarsus was. And he knew probably that specialty of using, it was a felt material that they made for tents, because waterproof with hair oils in it and all. It was tents, curtains, dividers, room dividers, like on a ship if you're traveling. And they also used them for overhangs for city areas. I've got a couple of shows there, like in a marketplace, like so. You see the overhangs so that the sun wasn't on them, or the rain wouldn't damage goods. And then let's see, I had theaters. These are the big projects that if you landed that contract, you had quite an awning there that you had to help create. And you know, when we see things like the Colosseum, we only see the ruins of it. We don't see what it looked like then. And this is a great book by David Macaulay called City, and it's the story of building Roman cities and construction. And so if you're interested, a classic book on showing how they started, how they built the arches. We've talked about the aqueducts, the capstone in the arch. It shows the whole process, and fascinating. But in this case, we're talking about leather workers and things the projects that they had and things they would do. And so they had tools, and you could carry those tools. They were fairly small tools of cutting and stitching. So it was a pretty mobile type of job or craft to have, and it was a craft. And so Paul, he gets into town in Corinth there, and Corinth is like one of the big tourist attractions where there's tourists that are going to want tents and awnings and tents for festivals. It's got the big, huge marketplaces. It's got Roman troops. So it's one of the going places that you'd set up a shop, and he probably goes to the neighborhood. Usually there was either a street or a group of people on a street that housed specific trades. They'd gather together in the same place, and he probably asked, hey, where's the tent makers street, or where do the tent makers sell and make? And so boom, he goes there and meets these guys, and might say, you got a job? You know, I come from a family business, and he probably, you know, can talk the lingo and knows the deal, and can convince them right away that he's worthy of being hired right away. And they might even, you know, where Aquila was from in Pontus is in the same general area of the world. He's far to the north, on the north coast of that part of the continent on the Black Sea, and Paul was on the Mediterranean coast, or closer to it, in Tarsus. But hey, being tent makers in that part of the world, maybe they knew of each other. You never know. I'm just reading things into it. But again, you got to put yourself in that place and wonder. Or they may have had people or places they had in common that they knew. But Paul gets hired. And not only does he get hired, they say, you can stay here. And I think there's another part of that story, and that is that they were also Christian. When he gets there, we don't hear anything in the stories anywhere in the New Testament about the conversion of Aquila and Priscilla. We just know he's a Jew from Pontus. But what we do find out fairly quickly is that they, in just these little lines there, as they introduce them, they came from Rome because of Claudius expelling, kicking out all the Jews out of the city of Rome. And we actually have historical corroboration for that in the historian Suetonius, who writes about that expelling. And when he describes why they kicked the Jews out, it was over some controversy that included Christos or Christus. Well, if it was spelled with an I, it would be real obvious, Christus. And he might have misspelled it, not knowing himself, not having been there necessarily, but being a historian writing about it. But if the Jews were having a problem with this Christus, they're having trouble, like we've seen with Paul in some of these other cities where there's riots, there's mobs about these people who are coming. They're saying to the synagogues, hey, the Messiah's come. And they start preaching it, and they start talking about it from the scriptures in the synagogue services, because they usually invited visitors. Well, in the city of Rome, it caused so much mob action and riots that the emperor himself says, you're out, go. And that's how they end up. The timing's right. It happens in 49 AD. And they're now in Corinth, setting up shop with their own business. And as they talked, you can imagine, they find out they're both Messiah believers, and the rest becomes a very close relationship. We also know from the stories later on that Paul will leave them in Ephesus and promises to come back. And they literally probably become the heads of that church there, or very important, prominent people, as he takes off right away and says, I'll be back. Then in the church meets in their home, we find out in Ephesus from 1 Corinthians. So they're the home church leaders. And then in Romans, Paul calls them fellow workers, which is a line reserved for a few people like Timothy and Mark and Luke. Those are people he calls fellow workers. There's several others that he uses that term for, but they're his closest associates, and we're going to find out that from here on out, they're connected in the work, in the missionary work for Jesus Christ, and particularly in a different way, because Paul, this chapter, as we talk about it, Paul's running all over the place again as an evangelist. And he's going from place to place, but Priscilla and Aquila are here, and with that house church, they're going to mentor people. They're discipling people, as we say. So he helps in them coming to the Lord, and then somebody's got to mentor them. And even though he takes some people and mentors them on the road, in his evangelism ministry, the people that are remaining that live in that town need people for the church to be mentoring in their leadership. And evidently Aquila and Priscilla fill that bill, and they're going to do it in a big way at the end of this chapter. So all to say, what an amazing first 2 verses of that whole thing, or 3 verses, because boom, there he shows up. He's got a place to work. He's got a place to live. He's probably got food on the table. It's pretty cool. And I might mention one more picture. I got one more from the city. Usually the shops were 2 or 3 stories, and you could let's see if I can find it real quick here. Yeah, there we go. They worked on the bottom floor.
Oh yeah.
And the shop, where's my finger? The shop's on the bottom floor there, but the residence was on the 2nd floor. And if it was a 3-story deal, same idea. They worked on the 1st floor there. The shop was open, and then the 2nd and 3rd floor, you had housing and apartments in Roman cities. And the deal was, the higher the apartment went, the less the rent. And
a little hotter up there.
You had to climb more stairs. No elevators, so
What?
at the end of a hard day of work.
You say that. I put this up on the Facebook site, and you can sort of see, like down in here where it's the 2 stories. Now these probably, I guess they could be residents. I don't know, but that's definitely sort of the thing that you're talking about there. It's amazing. So.
So yeah, that there's a place for him to stay. There's a room, and they graciously provide that hospitality for a fellow Jesus follower. And like I said, the rest will end up being history, as this is a very close missionary relationship. And it's interesting. Luke uses the name Priscilla.
Yes.
Because Priscilla is the affectionate, or they call it diminutive, the term for her name. And when Paul writes about them in his letters, he always uses the more formal Prissa or Prisca. You use the hard C, so it's Priscilla, or Priscia even possibly, as really pronounce it. But he uses the formal in speaking about her, maybe in deference to her role. And Luke has more of a more informal use of her name, and the more affectionate term. So it's we don't know how to look at that other than Luke feels a little freer to write that way, and Paul, when he writes about it, is maybe trying to, because she's a woman, because she has a leadership role in the church and in the house church, is trying to keep that a formality for her. And one other thing I'll just say about when that name appears, it the majority of the time it appears with her name first, which is very rare in the literature of the day. And so it's thought that it may be that she came from a higher status family, and married down, as they call it. I hate to use that term, but that as she married somebody who was simpler and was a middle class, worker type thing. And so they were giving her the deference in the order that it appears, and they are giving her Paul's giving her not only the deference in the order he uses, but giving her the deference of the formal name to have it be respectful. So anyway, there's a lot going on in that first 4 verses of the 18th chapter. And
we've only gotten to the first 2.5 verses. Because
sorry about that.
No, I mean,
but it's a great setup. I mean, it recreates some of that world for you.
Oh, well, it's amazing the depth that we get. I mean, this chapter. Listen, if we were to do a sermon series, if MacArthur was going to do a sermon series on this, John MacArthur, it would probably be 2 years.
That's right. When I'm not even going to talk about Corinth being like going to Las Vegas or something like that. What's done in Vegas stays in Vegas, and that was Corinth.
Well, when you showed that sort of the market square with the shadings over top of it, that's what I was going to say. Hey, this is Vegas. I mean, so try to keep us moving a little bit, because we could. Yeah, there's so much here. So it seems like when we get into verse 4 and 5. Okay, so we went through verse 1, 2, and 3. So it seems like Paul has, since he's by himself, and he seems to either be having to work or is working for whatever reason as a tent maker with these guys. He's going into the synagogues, he's meeting with the folks in the synagogues, but he's still working. And then it's not until we get in verse 5 that Silas and Timothy come. And then we get this word that it says Paul begins to devote himself completely to the word. So something in the beginning of this, and we know that Paul stays in Corinth for 18 months. We don't know. Yes, that's good.
That comes before the Gallio trial.
Yeah.
And then it says that after that he stayed again. So you could take that as being even additional time.
We just don't know that. But so we don't know how long it was of a period of time that he got to Corinth, and then when Silas and Timothy. Shoot, I mean, it could be months. You just don't know. But this turn happened where now, when they get there, he's really now full-time. full time back to the ministry and to that. So I mean, part of you can only speculate why has he gone from full time ministry to part time ministry and back. Good luck figuring that out. But then sort of the same old happens.
Yeah, I mean, next verse. They oppose Paul and become abusive, and it doesn't shake the dust off his feet, though that could be included in the clothing. She shakes the dust out of his clothes and says, adios.
It was interesting that
I'm going to the Gentiles, and this has been the pattern. They'll go to the Jews first, then the Gentiles.
The one commentary I was reading talked, and I never saw this one before, but this shaking off of your clothes being something from an allusion back to Nehemiah.
Oh, really?
Nehemiah 5:13, where Nehemiah, I guess, we always hear shake the dust, off your sandals, and Nehemiah, I guess, in shook the dust off his clothes. But anyways, it's the same old. But something to me is a little different because Paul he's a little brutal with the Jews this time. I mean, it's not. I mean, it harkens back to Pontius Pilate. This, when he said, "You want to crucify him? The blood's on your hand." I mean, this is a little over the top. He basically says, "Blood's on your hand from now on. I'm going to the Gentiles." You can just sort of see that passion. Is this a true statement? From this point on, does he just go to the Gentiles? Is he ever going back to the Jews?
Yeah, I think the pattern is that he's going to continue to attempt to, because of who he is. He was the guy with the right stuff who, was somebody that was in the meetings of the Sanhedrin. He was in Jerusalem. He was under one of the most famous rabbis and schools of rabbis. So I don't think he's going to lose it, but I think what happens is, it's just another, even probably bigger realization that that's not where it's going to be. And as you have this time in Athens, that's both reflective and fairly successful and doesn't cause a riot. And then he reflects back on having died already and, getting other people in these violent situations that, and then now he's worked with who knows how long with Priscilla and Aquila, and they've talked about their experience in Rome actually being kicked out by the Roman authorities because of the commotion of the Jews not wanting these people saying the Messiah has come. This may just be where, no patience at all now. It didn't look like he had a bunch before, but now it's like, as the story goes, from that first time he preached in a synagogue where he's pretty friendly about it and smiling. Now it's like, he tries, he goes in and reasons with them, they say, but there's no reasoning with him. And this is like one of those markers where you can see his patience is short and he's just not going to put up with that anymore. He's going to go where he believed God called him. And that's where when he had the conversion experience and God's talking to Ananias, he says, this is what he's chosen for, to take it to both. And the taking it to other Jews is not a surprise, but taking it to Gentiles, that's a pretty big surprise.
Well, there's two things that I find very funny. That is, back up a little bit. Paul doesn't get kicked out of Athens, and he meets up with people that got kicked out of Rome. All right, that's sort of funny. All right, so the roles are reversed. You can just imagine that conversation.
Sure.
We got kicked out of Rome. He's like, oh, yeah. I've got kicked out of every city.
Yeah, big deal. Yeah, even though I didn't get kicked out of Athens, they took me to Athens to get me out of another place.
So you can imagine that conversation. But then you get this verse where basically he just left the synagogue, says blood on your hands, and he left and went next door.
Next door. Yeah.
So,
The congregation splits,
yeah.
and he goes to members who live next door, or well, they're not non-members, they're God-fearers,
Yeah.
they're sympathizers, they're regular attenders of that synagogue, but not anymore. And then it says the synagogue ruler, one of the board members, and his entire house goes next door. So can you imagine every Sabbath those two groups of people seeing each other, staring daggers at each other in the parking lot?
Okay, so this is what it is right here, all right? It's Rolling Hills having a church split, and the church split happens at Copperhead Grill. and every Sunday they park in the same parking lot and figure out which way they're going to go. So, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. But so we find out that this Cryopus, who's a leader.
We'll call him Crispus. How about that? Crispy guy.
Krispy Kreme donuts.
Yeah.
So, he's a leader of the synagogue, and his family, they're baptized, and that's crazy there. And you could tell, I think, that Paul, and I'm reading between the lines, I'm giving you nothing more than my opinion, but I think he's ready to leave. I think between verse 8 and 9, he's ready to leave, but he gets this vision, and it's very strange. It says the Lord said to him, and then in my Bible, it's red letters. Don't be afraid any longer. I got people here.
The Lord is Jesus.
Yeah, and the Lord is Jesus. So he gets this, and that's when we find out that, hey, he's going to stay. And he said, it's sort of interesting. He says, no man will attack you in order to harm you. Okay. He didn't say no man will attack you. He just said no man will, and I'm reading from the NASB, no man will attack you in order to harm you. So he's not going to get stoned.
No one's going to attack and harm.
Yeah.
Harm you. It just, they might attack you.
So they settle in. It sounds like they settle in for a while. And it says, a year and 6 months, but this next episode where they get sued, truly they get sued. And talk about this proconsul, and then, sort of, I guess, I don't want to say typical politician, but typical politician. These guys get brought in. What does he do?
Yeah, I mean, this particular governor just doesn't even let Paul speak. I mean, it says just as Paul was about to say what he needed to say, unless they had some, counsel off to the sidebar before all this or something, the guy says, "Hey, look."
It's Silas holding him back again.
Yeah. Hey, if you don't have to say anything, don't say anything. It just makes it worse. But so what happens is the guy says, look, hey, this is no crime in my laws. There's nothing in the Roman law book for me as governor to be enforcing here. So you guys take care of this yourself. This is your Torah. This is your Jewish law stuff. And that's your organization. That's your religion's business. And you can't use me with it. So I will not be judge of such things. And he had him ejected from the court. So he just kicks everybody out. But poor Sosthenes,
I was going to say,
board of that first synagogue.
So he says, I don't want to have anything to do with it. You work it out. So what do? They
beat him in front of the court, right in front of the court building. And I guess nobody does anything about it. Nobody's arrested or anything. And he shows no concern, whatever. Okay, no big deal. I told them to do it. They did it. It wasn't exactly what I hoped would happen, but
street justice.
I guess. I mean, you're right. It's like this poor Sosny, or however you pronounce his name. You know, he's just. What did he do?
Yeah, we don't even know. He's not the same, unless this other guy had two names.
Yeah.
Unless Crispus had two names. Sosthenes, maybe he just didn't do enough, or he was just standing there and was one of the people involved, or maybe he'd also gone and was sympathizing or saying, hey, maybe he'd say, let's not sue him. You just don't know what he was there for, but no matter, he got a whooping, and that's again in the beginning of verse 18. Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time.
Yeah.
So it could be even longer, or it could be part of that 18 months, like you said. But they hung out,
yeah,
and they discipled, and they worked with it, and now he gets on a boat and gets out of town, and they didn't walk him there necessarily.
But yeah, I mean, hey, listen, he's like, this is probably why he wrote 2 letters to the Corinthians, because they didn't kick him out of town.
Right. As the vision said,
yeah.
and I think that the words of that vision it's short but sweet. Keep on speaking, for I am with you, and no one's going to attack and harm you, because I have. Jesus says this. I have many people in this town. That's pretty cool. Especially to be considered one of his people.
Well, now, listen. As we're not going to tag ourselves as Calvinist or Arminian, but you can take that line and go, hey, Calvinist here. See what it says. But we're not going to do that.
Right. Well, again, they had a couple years to convert some people, so
they found as Spurgeon said, they found the yellow line down the back. So getting back onto the story before we get too crazy.
Yeah.
They head to the sea, and he's taken Priscilla and Aquila with him, and they're going to be heading to Ephesus. But Paul does something interesting here, which is he gets a haircut. All right. And, we can speculate a little bit here, but I think we agree Luke is telegraphing something here, because it's such a little blip, you know what I mean? That you think when you read it here that it has no meaning whatsoever, but it does.
But if you're reading, like you said, you're reading and you read this line in the NIV for the film, he had his hair cut off.
Yeah.
So he goes either bald or really short, and because of a vow he had taken. Well, what's that about? It just leaves it right there and moves on. So should we, and then come back and say, hey, here's what was going on? But it will telegraph it it doesn't take until the 20s where it comes back up, and he's in Jerusalem, that he's completing this series of spiritual practices of this particular vow being taken. And if you want to talk more about the Nazarite vow, or we can just say, we'll just say that word and then later.
Well, I mean, we'll drop a little bit of knowledge, because honestly, this is pretty much all we've got. Because I don't think there's any definite thing here, but some of the scholars suggest that this could possibly be a vow of the Nazarene, which you would be cutting your hair. And interesting, one of the things that has to be done then is purification in the temple in Jerusalem, which, like you say, when we get to Jerusalem at the end of his third missionary journey, really the end of his missionary journey, sort of, until he goes into jail for a while, he has to go in to be purified to basically this vow. So I don't know that's sort of what we got, Yeah,
it's kind of a recommitment. I could see it as a commitment to the Lord of holiness, like, Lord, I'm recommitting my ministry to you. And really, maybe it kind of hits with that, with what's happened in just this period of time where he almost died, or did die, and came back to life. He's now more than ever made a very vehement statement about, my ministry is, the hallmark of it's going to be with the Gentiles. Yeah. And he makes that vow that, Lord, I'm yours more than ever. This is where we're going. Again, I recommit myself, and that involves certain things that need to get done that don't get done for a little bit, but will eventually.
It's obviously Luke is trying to tell us something there. It's not just this little, trivia thing that we can do, when we have our Bible trivia. So.
Yeah, which the other telegraphing of this situation is about Timothy, that we talked about yesterday, when he's of mixed parentage, Jew and Gentile, and he gets circumcised there. When they get to the temple, the charge is going to be that he brought somebody uncircumcised into the temple grounds, and that's going to cause a big riot right there, and a big hubbub with both the Christians and the temple folks. So both of these are things that happen out on the mission field that eventually back in Jerusalem are going to surface back up for him to come and fulfill that vow that he's taking of the purification, and then bringing these other people with him that's going to rile things up. So it's a fascinating thing to see Luke's including and writing these things into the story, because it's all going to come back later. Yeah. And it's the story. So all he's really doing is relating all this stuff that was just amazing. It's not coincidence. It's not a detail that he's going to forget. It's going to come to the fruition later.
So, it's fabulous. And it's that's why every little detail that's sitting there in Scripture has meaning. Sometimes we don't know what it is, but it's there for a reason. So he gets he gets his haircut, for his vow, and then they head to Ephesus.
Yep.
And so Priscilla and Aquila are with him.
Another big Roman city where tent making is a big deal.
Yep.
Yeah, where Priscilla and Aquila can set up shop and have their projects, or maybe continuing something that is hopping, or it's easily, there's enough work there that both as a tourist place and as a Roman center for troops, and it's a wealthy city of the empire, a big trade and travel city. So he's going to leave them there and keep going, which that surprises me. When I'm reading it, I know that in my head, but you'll see, well, I'm leaving you here. He goes to the synagogue, but he leaves them there and keeps going. So.
Well, and he leaves a couple of people, because Timothy and Silas are still in Corinth. All right. So they stay there. And remember, they've been up in Bree and probably going up to Philippi and all that stuff. Luke's been gone for a while now. Now he's going to Ephesus. We learn that he goes into the synagogue, teaches, and they're like, come back next week. And he's like, no. And so he gets a boat and heads to Caesarea. And,
that's a trip.
That's a trip. All right. Yeah.
It's about half the Mediterranean right there.
Yeah. It's a long way. So we get this idea. The maps show that he goes from Ephesus to Caesarea, goes down Jerusalem, and then comes back up to Antioch. Now that's what the maps show. The Scripture is a little bit different, where it says that he, where is that line? So he gets to Caesarea.
22, 23.
Yeah, 20 and 22. He lands in Caesarea. He went up and greeted the church, which sounds like he went to Jerusalem because he's going up to Jerusalem, and then he went down, which is north, to Antioch, and he spent some time there. So it sounds like he went to Jerusalem, but he's spending his time. I mean, you don't know. I mean, but he's spending his time in Antioch, probably giving his report. But he's got missionary people, team members in the field now, and he's alone, as far as we know, from a scripture standpoint.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's, you mentioned it yesterday. We're seeing
he's again part of this, part of the vow, there's a life change experience going on here somehow, some ways, like doing things differently. He's moving fast, not standing in any one place very long, not going to new places here except for the Ephesus stop, and just says, I'll be back. But he's on the move, and he's got some kind of mission, but it's certainly nothing we know about or is told us. But he is going back to Antioch, and I think if he went in Caesarea, he spent a lot of time there. But though he was in prison, he spent a lot of time there and was well known there. Jerusalem, if he got there, and Caesarea, Antioch in Syria, he's reporting back. It looks to me, again, if you're going to infer things, he's reporting back to his home bases to say, hey, this is where it's gone, and this is where we are. And maybe even looking for financial help, missionary help again, and that kind of support that's going to fund it back, to take it further. Because, you just don't know, or maybe he's looking for people to join him. We don't know what is on his heart, but there's something going on that sending him back home for a little bit to send him back out to the mission again.
Well, this idea of him going up to the church, up and to the church. Again, it's totally reading between the lines, because it doesn't say that he went to Jerusalem, but it would make sense from what you just said, but then also what they were doing on the second missionary trip, which was delivering the decree from the Jerusalem Council, where you can really think of that's where his second missionary journey started. So again,
it's like touching back base. That mission has been accomplished.
Yep.
And now there's a third phase. What do we do next? And maybe he's giving that presentation to them that here's the future. Yep. And we're in these major cities now of diaspora Jews, as well as Gentiles who are eager to become part of the movement. And we need your support, and just to let you know where there are people now that are believers.
So it's fascinating from this aspect. You've got Silas and Timothy in Corinth. You've got Priscilla and Aquila here in Ephesus. Paul is sitting here in Antioch, and
Luke's in Philippi.
Luke's in Philippi. That's right. And so now he doesn't, he stays there for a few days, but verse 23 kicks off the third missionary journey. And it is not one of those, it's one verse. he spent some time there, and then he left, So, before we got the laying on of hands, we've got, the Barnabas and split the second time. Now it's just he left, and he's sort of following that line up to the Galatia region, where they were, just to check on the brethren, and that's all we get. That's verse 23. That's it.
Yeah, and then 19:1 finishes that off. If we were to dip into the next one, which is Paul took the road through the interior and arrived at Ephesus. Well, that's a lot of miles to cover, and he's covered thousands of miles right there on foot, and we don't have any stories from there.
That's months of foot travel. I mean, that's months. I mean, there's a lot of stories that we don't have a clue, because what happens is at verse 24, we're back in Ephesus. We're back in Ephesus, and it's So here's Paul walking back into the wilderness, and honestly, months until he's going to arrive at Ephesus, which is where we'll pick up in chapter 19. But we're going to pop over to Ephesus right now, because this guy named Apollos is just arrived into town, and it sounds like he's preaching. And he's doing all right, but what happens?
So this is where that discipling ministry kind of takes place, that you see Aquila and Priscilla being able to do, and that they it's interesting how they put it, in that the baptism that Apollos knew about was the baptism of John the Baptist, was the preparing the way for Jesus to come, and it wasn't a Jesus baptism necessarily. Yeah, so another piece of evidence that there was stuff going on out there with disciples of John the Baptist, maybe at least news from Jerusalem and Judea on out through the rest of the Mediterranean Jewish population, who had been in Jerusalem probably for Passover, for Pentecost, for tabernacles, for the festivals, and they'd gone back and they'd talked about it, and actually people might have gotten baptized while they were there, and went and told them, hey, John is proclaiming that Messiah is coming, that there's a repent, it's God's timing's coming. And then for Apollos to bump into them, he's saying, hey, there is another baptism. There's a baptism in Jesus and the Holy Spirit. Excuse me. And they teach him accurately about the Lord. It says he had been instructed in the way of the Lord. So that would even mean, he knew about Jesus a little bit there, but didn't know about what had happened with Pentecost and maybe some of what happened after that. So they encourage him, and they write to disciples to welcome him to the next place. He's got a preaching ministry himself, and he's going places to evangelize. They explain to him the way more adequately, and they send him. And so he vigorously refutes the Jews in public debate, proving from the scriptures that Jesus was the Christ. And we have to remember again, this is the Old Testament scriptures, or the Hebrew scriptures he's proving this from, much like we've seen from Paul when he's in the synagogue. And Apollos is doing that same kind of thing, but with a Gentile name, by the way.
Well, let's go back to that. Hey, we want to be an Acts church. Who started the church of Ephesus? Probably truly Priscilla and Aquila. Mm-hmm. And then Apollos came, and
right, he shows up.
And he shows up, and they teach him a more accurate way. I love that, they fix his doctrine, and so you look at it, boy, can you imagine launching a church today by somebody saying, well, I think I heard this story. I need to start telling. I need to start discipling people, and that's how probably the Church of Ephesus. Which, think about the pastors they've had. All right, Paul will have been there. Apollos has been there. Aquila and Priscilla have been there. Timothy's going to be there. John's going to be there.
Look out.
and guess what? They still messed up a little bit because they lost their first love. So blame it on the pastor. Can't do that. But that's where we sort of end.
Yeah, that's quite a convergence there in Ephesus, isn't it?
Yeah, and so we end there, and it's a bizarre ending to a chapter because it feels like the group that left in that second missionary journey, and the people that they picked up, they're all over the place.
Yeah, they're
Paul's
scattered.
Paul's on the road by himself, as far as we know, for a long time. I mean, he's doing a through hike on the Appalachian Trail right now, so it's going to be a long time. He's going to have a couple of pair of sandals that he goes through until he shows back up on the scene. And so it's a weird way to end a chapter, isn't it?
Absolutely, it is. And it's been pointed out that 24 through 28, those 5 verses that talk about it, are something Paul wouldn't know about anyway. That they would have, Luke would have had to get the story from Priscilla and Aquila, catching up with them on the road somewhere, because, or Apollos for that matter, he'd have to interview those guys to find out exactly what went on in that story, because, like I said, Paul's out of town. He's on the road. He's on a very long and a solo journey, apparently, maybe needing some time to think. We talked about too in that bigger picture of the Paul learning a learning curve going on here with the missionary type thing. And the first missionary journey, they all came and they all returned back together to Antioch. In this place, as you pointed out, he's left people all over the place, and he's left people in Philippi. He's left people, or there's at least people left there. It didn't even say that he left them there, but there's people here, people there, people in these major places they've been, so that there's, instead of just going there, proclaiming Jesus and leaving, they've left disciplers there. They've left leadership there from the local as well as from the Antioch and from Jerusalem. And then he stayed a long time there at the last in Corinth.
Yeah.
Well, that's the key, and that's what's going to happen in Ephesus again. He's going to spend some time there, and he's still an evangelist, and that's still his specialty. And he's going to be traveling all kinds of places again pretty soon. But he's when he makes the 4th, as they call it, missionary journey to Rome. But it's the kind of thing where he figured it out that you need people, you need relationships, you need leadership, you need mentoring, you need discipleship to continue that process on to make disciples and to continue to help make disciples, because it's a lifelong process. None of us are finished. We're all unfinished products, and we need help all along the way. So thank the Lord that even though he didn't hang around to do it, he knew well enough. And you mentioned it being a leadership change. You might want to say more about that.
Well, I mean, it's like I called it a leadership management change, because what I see in Paul is Paul was your typical, if I put it in business terms, he's your typical startup entrepreneurial guy, hands in everything. And then what happens, what we're seeing happen is he realizes that he can't do it all, that he has to, basically bring up people and then let them go and bring up people. And I think when we get to the 3rd missionary trip, he takes it even a further level, where now he's doing, much more writing, much more of an instructional standpoint, where he's not even there. You know what I mean? He's getting information from them and answering questions. So he's even getting, if you think of it, more hands-off, from the standpoint of he's giving instructions, he's giving commentary on the teaching, but he's doing it from other cities. So what you see is this entrepreneur that's growing from, a mom and pop shop to a small medium business to a corporation. Again, that's business world, but it's a definite mindset change, because, and it's a good thing to understand, you can't do it by yourself. You can't do it by yourself at all. You want to learn the Bible, great, you can read it, but it all comes down to the relationships, the communications, the sharing of ideas, because every one of us look at something different. We come at it from a different angle, and that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing.
Yep, you're right about that.
So,
Hallelujah.
I can't believe we made it through that chapter.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Well, we talked about it, and I'll share it while you're getting your prayer book.
Yeah.
Which is you look at these chapters, and there was a lot going on in this chapter, not only people wise, but places, and trying to keep up with all the journeys. I'm glad we made it.
Oh,
does it get
amazing.
easier? I don't know.
Woo! Yeah, I had a thing of, oh, there it is, the prayer. It's not the prayer Bible again. Sorry about that.
That's all right. Listen, the next time I don't mention it, you will have that one.
I will have it. You're right. I don't try. It just things come. But I wanted it to be a challenge for us along the lines that we're talking about right now, to find other people to link up with as partners in ministry. It could be old friends. It can be relatives, for that matter, like Barnabas and John Mark. It can be new acquaintances, like Priscilla, Aquila, and Paul. We're maybe presently strangers, but we bump into each other by God's grace and providence. But to find other people to go on mission with and ministry with, to share it in that small group sense of having prayer partners that can not only pray together, but pray for each other when we head out of town or when we're on some mission outside of what we're doing, to seek out discussion partners, because that's big, to get somebody else's ear and heart about what's going on in our community, in our ministry, our family, our world. Find some existing ministries. Then they went and found existing ministries, though they kind of exploded some. Others, it was helpful to be a part of it. And there's ministries in our churches that need people. And we will find that God things happen when we start to talk about what God's calling us to do, hopefully, and what God's calling other people to do. And sometimes it doesn't end up being there. It does end up being somewhere else because we get frustrated and it may not work out. But hey, God's going to use it somewhere, somehow. And it could be a new area, new concerns, something that's not going on in our community. And as partners, as prayer partners and discussion partners and neighbors and yoke fellows, if you will, we pray and talk and commit and go after a mission for Jesus Christ in our neighborhood, in our town, in our world. So I just want to have us be thinking about that as an open-eyed prayer there.
There you go.
Pray for God's Holy Spirit to convict us of who is it that's right around us right now in this time where we're taking a time out in many ways and trying to figure out what are we going to do next, and how to it's not going to go back to normal, or maybe it shouldn't go back to normal. We have it go back to go forward to something even better, and use this time as a retreat time to be ready to go back out and blaze some new trails in ministry.
Oh, Lord. Well, you know this.
I pray that.
Yeah, there you go. Well, you know this. Amen. But, this whole pandemic was not a surprise to God. So, if you believe in the sovereignty of God, He's in control, and no matter if this is good or evil, it will be used for His glory. And I think,
redeemed.
Yeah. And listen, that that should give you comfort there, even though, some people are still stuck inside, all the worries and concerns that you got there.
Yeah. Some people are very sick.
Yeah.
Some people overworked by it.
Well,
because they're not stuck inside their essential medical workers.
Yeah, I posted the song. There was a great song from a group I've never heard of before, and the chorus at the end is, God's not worried, so why should I worry? And it's like, nothing better than that. So, well, there you go. We made it.
Thank you, Chris. I've got that starred in my email to go hit that link, so I'll go do it.
Okay, very good. Well, we will see you all.
Listen to that song.
Oh yeah, no, it's great. Oh gosh, I listened to it over and over again. But we will see you tomorrow. We'll pick up Paul. Paul will come out of the wilderness tomorrow. How's that? And we'll see what he has to do.
All right.
Take care. God bless everybody.
Bye bye.